Welcome to another Rewind review, and in this video we journey to Panem to take a look at the first instalment of The Hunger Games. Released in 2012 and based on the novel by Suzanne Collins, the movie sees Katniss Everdeen voluntarily taking her young sister's place in The Hunger Games, a televised competition in which two teenagers from each of the 12 districts of Panem are chosen at random to fight to the death. Adapted for screen by director Gary Ross, Billy Ray and author Suzanne Collins, The Hunger Games stars Jennifer Lawrence, Josh Hutcherson, Liam Hemsworth, Elizabeth Banks, Woody Harrelson, Stanley Tucci, Alexander Ludwig, Lenny Kravitz, Wes Bentley, Amanda Stenberg and Donald Sutherland. Back in the 2010s there was a bit of a surge of movie adaptations that were based on books aimed at young adults. And outside of things like Twilight and The Mortal Instruments, most of the stuff that they were adapting were dystopian sci-fi novels. And we ended up getting adaptations of things like The Maze Runner, The Host, Ender's Game, The Fifth Wave and even Divergent. None of them really took off enough to really be as successful as I think that they were hoping that they were going to be, especially things like Divergent, which decided to do the exact same thing that a lot of other movie franchises were doing at the time and splitting their final instalment into two parts. But because part one was nowhere near as successful as they wanted it to be, part two has never been made. But among all of these adaptations that were getting made at the time, one series really stood out and did get a lot more attention, and that was The Hunger Games. As I said in my review for The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, The Hunger Games series, while still having cliches and tropes that usually appear in young adult novels, it was something a bit different. And not just that, the movies were actually really interesting and the reception for them was far more positive than any of those other movies that I mentioned. When it comes to my history with The Hunger Games, I do remember at the time that the movie was getting marketed that I do remember seeing a lot of clips and a few trailers here and there for it. And I do remember thinking that it did look quite interesting. But I didn't go to see the first movie when it first came out in cinemas. I have seen it in cinemas now, but the first time that I saw this one was when it was released on DVD. And from that point on, I was hooked. By that point in time, I had already bought all three books. They came together in a collector's set, but for some reason I just didn't get round to reading them. And I'll admit, I did the exact same thing with Game of Thrones as well. It's a big box as well. But after I watched the first movie, I knew that I needed to properly dive into the books, and I absolutely blasted through all three of them before Catching Fire was even released. So yeah, I enjoyed them. And seeing as though we have a sixth movie in the franchise in development right now, with the book that it's based on, Sunrise on the Reaping, being released this month, I thought that now was the perfect opportunity to go back to the start and revisit the first instalment. So let's get into The Hunger Games. The Hunger Games takes place in the distant future after a rebellion against the wealthy capital saw the nation of Panem divided into districts. And as punishment for the rebellion, the capital created a contest called The Hunger Games, where one teenage boy and girl from each district, chosen by lottery, must compete in a battle royale style event until only one survives. And on this, the 74th annual Hunger Games, Katniss Everdeen from District 12 volunteers to take the place of her younger sister after her name is called. And what follows sees Katniss and her fellow tribute Peter Millark taken to the capital, where they must put on a spectacle and schmooze the rich and powerful into gaining much needed sponsors to help them out during the event, until eventually they make it to the arena and the fight for their survival begins. This film is essentially split into two halves, and both halves kind of feel like their own separate movies. The first half of this movie focuses on world building and the celebrity entertainment aspect of the Hunger Games event, and the second half focuses on what goes on within the arena. Within the first half of the movie, we do get to see a little bit of the world of Panem. We do get to visit some of the districts. It's mainly District 12 where Katniss Everdeen comes from, and we do see a few glimpses of the capital itself. Not a lot, but enough to really showcase the contrast between the two worlds. Even something as simple as bed sheets, or as Peter says during the Caesar Flickerman chat show, the showers, and even the fashion and overall aesthetic. I'm going to hazard a guess and say that the costume department, the hair and makeup team and the set designers had a load of fun making this movie. The people who live in the capital have this slightly out there, sometimes garish look that looks like something that you'd see in a fashion show. The weird ones, I'm sorry, I meant to say art. They're all very made up with very heavy makeup and wild hairstyles and costume choices. And a lot of the colours that all of the characters do wear do really pop on screen. But the actual place that they live in is quite tech heavy. It looks quite clean and quite polished. It's still quite futuristic, but it still looks quite tangible as well. And I think the reason for that is because most of the sets in this movie are actual locations. Whereas the districts, as I said, we only really see District 12 in this movie. is very grimy, gritty, ingrained into its surroundings, in this case a forest, and it does feel like an actual community, especially when you see things like the markets. The contrast between the districts and the capital is portrayed in a very believably jarring way, especially since this is seen through the eyes of Katniss Everdeen, and I love how it's even reflected in the soundtrack as well, and I'll get into that a little bit later on. It's excellent, and it really sells the believability, the realism, and the history of Panem in a really good, effective way. And then as we move into the second half of the movie, the tone of the film turns into something a lot more horrifying and a lot more intense as Katniss and the other tributes enter the arena and the Hunger Games event actually begins. It does feel like a different movie, yes, but it works very well, partly because this is what has been built up throughout the first half, and partly because of the commentary and cutaways to the game makers. None of that stuff is in the books, by the way. You only see what it is that Katniss sees. But I actually really like that decision, because you're not only seeing what it is that the game makers are doing and the manipulation that they have on the actual arena, so a load of random events like the forest going on fire and things like that. It now makes sense. It's not just a random thing that happens. It also shows what's going on within the world of Panem. It fleshes the world out a lot more, and it fills in a load of gaps. These additional scenes really flesh out what's going on within the world of Panem while the Hunger Games is taking place. Like, you see haymitch actually getting involved, stepping up and actually helping out Katniss by getting sponsorships. You see the riots starting to kick off in District 11, plus you also get frequent reminders that the people of the capital only view the Hunger Games as entertainment and like reality TV. For the people in the districts, the Hunger Games is a very distressing, very traumatizing event, but for the people in the capital, it's just entertainment. It's like gladiators in ancient Rome meeting a reality TV show like Big Brother or I'm a Celebrity, and it's all presented by Graham Norton. I think that's a pretty accurate description, to be honest. Anyway, the actual games themselves, there is this genuine sense of tension and atmosphere throughout this section as Katniss has to rely on her wits to survive. Alliances are formed and broken, the game makers throw in a few surprises, and there are plenty of shocking developments. This section of the movie is very unpredictable, and it is quite nerve-wracking as well, because you're not quite sure what it is that's going to happen next. It even has a good few jump scares as well. There is a romantic subplot throughout this section too between Katniss and Peter that's built up across the movie. As I said, this does have a few tropes and cliches that pop up in these kinds of stories, so of course it does have a kind of love triangle. And unfortunately, in my opinion, I feel like this is the weakest aspect of this entry. It does have some nice moments, don't get me wrong, and I do like that this is something that does continue to evolve across subsequent movies. But in this one, it kind of feels more ambiguous than an actual love story, the Katniss-Peter side. I definitely questioned how real it was. To me, it does feel more like a rush of emotion or them just wanting a little bit of comfort within the arena, especially after everything that's happened by that point. Outside of like a 2-second clip, Gale doesn't really become a factor into this aspect of the Hunger Games series until Catching Fire. You can tell that he does like Katniss, you can tell that there is definitely a lot of deep history between the two of them, but the actual romantic side of it isn't really addressed until Catching Fire. I don't know, as I said, this is just my opinion. I definitely feel like they could have done a lot more with it to try and help sell it a little bit more, but I do think and I do like that it does evolve across the sequels. But across everything that happens in this movie, the tension, the horror, the romance, none of it would matter if we didn't care about the characters, and that's one aspect that this movie really does excel at. This is a very character-driven movie, and at the forefront of it is Jennifer Lawrence as Katniss Everdeen. Katniss Everdeen is a brilliant character, and when it comes to Jennifer Lawrence's performance, she is flawless in this role. I know that Jennifer Lawrence had done other movies prior to the release of Hunger Games like Winter's Bone and X-Men First Class, so she was already an established name within Hollywood when these movies were released. But I feel like this is the movie where she became a household name. And it's not hard to see why, because on the surface, Katniss can sometimes be slightly withdrawn, maybe appear slightly emotionless, but it's all a front she puts on. So when she does break down and she becomes more emotional or aggressive, it does hit a lot harder. She has been through a lot by the time this movie takes place, including having to step up and take on a provider and carer role for her family, mainly for her younger sister Prim, played very well by Willow Shields. It's a very subtle performance at times, and I feel like that is why Jennifer Lawrence's performance is so good in this movie, because she is able to convey so much through just like little expressions. You can see what's going on behind her eyes. I feel like what it is that she has done for this character is brilliant. She absolutely sells everything that this character is going through and feeling, even when all the barriers are up. Katniss Everdeen is a very internalized character, and I don't feel like most people will pick up just how internalized she is unless you've read the books. That's something that I'm going to bring up in a minute. But even with that said, not only is Jennifer Lawrence's performance in this movie absolutely amazing, I feel like how the movie is made does a really good job of putting you in Katniss's shoes. The cinematography and the sound design really do help emphasise what it is that's going on with her. Like, there's a scene where she gets interviewed on stage in front of thousands of people, and because she's panicking and nervous about it, the sound becomes increasingly muffled to help reflect that. It's very clever and it is very effective. There's some very heightened scenarios that Katniss does experience in this movie, like the volunteer scene and all the stuff that she goes through with Rue, and all of it and how it's all done and how it's performed is absolutely brilliant. I really love what it is that they've done with this character. It feels real, it feels grounded and raw, and I absolutely love what they've done here. Katniss is a terrific character, and I think that they have brought her to life absolutely wonderfully. Like the book, the movie is done primarily through Katniss's perspective, and I have admitted before that when I was reading the books for the first time, it did catch me off guard, and it wasn't something that I was really used to because I've never read a book that was in first person before. But that does lead me onto something that I would like to talk about when it comes to this movie, and that's how this movie handles exposition. I will admit, the first time that I watched this movie, there were a load of things that get mentioned, that get brought up, that get referenced, that I just did not understand, and it did confuse me a little bit until it was that I read the book. The biggest ones for me are when Katniss and Gale mention how many times their names have been entered into the games. Essentially, the more rations that they buy, the more times their name is entered into the Hunger Games ballot. There's a sequence during the Tracker Jacker acid trip sequence where you see a house exploding and miners going off to work. Now, this could be just me being thick, but I didn't pick up on what that scene was actually meant to be. It shows what happens to Katniss's dad, and it also shows what happened to her mum afterwards. Plus, there is one other thing that does happen in this movie that I'll admit didn't confuse me, but it did confuse another person who I know who has seen this movie. And that's when the dogs appear. In the movie, I will admit, it does look like they just make them out of thin air, so I do get it. But if they actually showed what those dogs are, this movie would instantly get a higher age rating. I mean, I genuinely don't know how these movies kept getting away with 12A ratings. In the Hunger Games book, the dogs are known as mutts or mutations, and they're genetically engineered and created by the Capitol, using the deceased tributes. So I get why that was changed. I feel like the movie does very wisely use the commentary to try and help fill in a few gaps here and there, because Caesar Flickerman is watching everything on a TV screen and he's presenting it like a sports show. And he actually does sort of fill in a few things that you might be a little bit confused on or you might not understand, like the Tracker Jacker sequence. Plus you also see what it is that the game makers are doing to manipulate the events that are going on within the arena. But as I said, there are definitely times where it does feel like the information will just go over the audience's head unless you've read the book. Especially that sequence where they do talk about how many times their names are in the ballot box. I get why it is that they are talking that way, and I actually do appreciate that they do talk the way that they do in this movie, because they wouldn't explain it to each other, because this is their lives and it's what they've been through this entire time. So I do appreciate the decision to make them talk like real people and not start going, as you know. That would actually be quite a funny scene, to be honest. As you know, Katniss, every time you take out more rations, the more times our names are added. Yes, I know that, Gale. It is a bit nitpicky, but it is something that I did feel like I needed to mention. This is going to be one of the longer videos, isn't it? Let's talk about some of the other characters. There are quite a lot of characters that do make appearances throughout the first Hunger Games movie, and a lot of those characters only make brief appearances. Like Katniss's mum, Primrose, Gale, the majority of the other tributes, including an early appearance from Jack Quaid, the game makers like Seneca Crane, played by Wes Bentley, and even Cinna, played rather surprisingly and very well by Lenny Kravitz. Even though a lot of these characters only really have a minor role in the overall movie, I do think that everyone performing in this movie does pull their weight, and I do think that everyone delivers some excellent performances. Rue, played by Amanda Stenberg, is really good, again, despite not being a huge part of the movie. But what happens with her, the fact that Katniss forms a connection with her, possibly because she reminds her of Prim, and how that plays out does have a significant impact on Katniss as a character, and it does provide the initial spark for the rebellion to start in District 11. Cato, played by Alexander Ludwig, initially starts off as quite thuggish and two-dimensional, but later on you see what the games have done to him, and even though he is a violent nutcase, you do kind of feel a bit sorry for him. And again, the performance from Alexander Ludwig is really good. And then we have Peter Millark, played excellently by Josh Hutcherson. Other than Katniss, Peter is given a lot of focus as one of the primary characters, and he is really likeable and charming. And like Cato, there is a few moments where you do feel a bit sorry for him, especially when you find out that his own mum thinks that he doesn't have a chance of winning. That is harsh. But at the same time, there was always like this little level of mistrust, at least in my opinion, because I never could quite tell whether his love for Katniss was actually real or if he was just playing the game. It is something that does become more obvious as the movie progresses and over the subsequent movies, but I do think in this movie there was definitely a little bit of doubt, a little bit of mistrust, and it was something that did cross my mind. He is a great character, Josh Hutcherson plays him really well, and I love how he evolves across this series. But Peter is not my favourite character in this movie. My favourite character is Haymitch, played by Woody Harrelson. My judgment of Haymitch when he first appears was so far off what he actually is, because I honestly thought that he would be a proper nasty piece of work. I could not have been more wrong. Haymitch is a fantastic character. He starts off as this uncaring drunk who wants nothing to do with Katniss and Peter, but when you realise what he himself has been through, not only during the games in which he won, which I won't spoil for those who have not read the book, it even came with a really snazzy bookmark as well. Anyway, it's the fact that Haymitch was the last victor of the Hunger Games to come from District 12, and as the victor, as the champion, he has to mentor the next set of tributes. And this continues and it goes on every single year until that district, District 12, has a new victor, and then they take over as mentors. And by the time that both Katniss and Peter have been selected as tributes, a whole 24 years have passed since Haymitch won his games. So that's 24 years of tributes that he has trained up, only to send them off to their deaths. So you absolutely understand why he is the way he is, especially when he meets both Katniss and Peter, because he doesn't really have any hope for them whatsoever, because why would these two be any different from the past 24 years? He is a genuinely great character, played perfectly by Woody Harrelson, and I love how we see him slowly starting to care about Katniss and actually stepping up to help her out during the games. Plus, he does sprinkle in a few moments of much needed dry humour, and his character contrasts really well with characters like Effie Trinket, also played to perfection by Elizabeth Banks. She is absolutely wonderful in these movies, and I do like that she does add a little bit of levity. When you first meet her, you're not quite sure what to make of her, but as the series progresses, you do slowly start to warm up to her a lot more. And she is a really great character, and she is a load of fun. Also, I need to give a shout out to Stanley Tucci. He plays Caesar Flickerman, and he is so much fun to watch. But of course, we need to have a primary antagonist, and in the Hunger Games series, we have the legendary Donald Sutherland as President Snow. Now, I can't really say too much about President Snow in this movie because we don't really see that much of him. He only has a very light presence in this instalment. In fact, the first time that I saw this, it didn't even cross my mind that he was meant to be the main antagonist. But thanks to a very long and detailed email from Donald Sutherland to the director, there are several scenes that were added to help flesh Snow out and give an insight into how he sees and feels about the games and Katniss. That email is definitely worth a read. It is online, it is available to read if you have never read it before. I do think that it is worth looking up, especially if you are a fan of this series, because it is quite fascinating. Donald Sutherland is perfectly cast as President Snow, and in the brief moments that we see him in this movie, he is absolutely flawless. This is a movie adaptation that really treats its source material with respect, and it definitely helps that one of the screenwriters was the author, and the performances are so good, nobody is phoning it in. This is a very dark movie that handles some deep, mature and complex themes in a very serious, sometimes thought-provoking way. Yes, some of those themes are handled about as subtly as a sledgehammer, but I do appreciate that they do have the guts to actually go near a lot of these themes and really delve into them. And I really appreciate that they were able to do this story justice without having to water it down. And this absolutely includes the action sequences. This is a bloody violent movie for something that's rated at 12A, but there's no blood, so it's all good. I can't lie, it does still have some pretty shocking moments. I do believe there is an edited version of this movie where you do see a little bit of blood splatter, and I don't know if it's a little bit longer or not, and I believe that version is rated at 15 in the UK, but I haven't seen that version of the movie, so I can't really say too much about it. This can be very brutal at times, and I really appreciate that they don't tone it down too much. It's very intense, and it does have some moments that are genuinely hard to watch, in more ways than one. Yeah, you knew this bit was coming. Let's talk about the cinematography. In terms of the overall look for this movie, I think that it looks really nice. In fact, it kind of looks like an indie movie. But, and especially during the action sequences, the camera work and the editing is quite messy, to the point where this is a genuine case of shaky cam. Seeing this movie at home was one thing. Getting to see it on the cinema, honestly, it made the shaky cam look worse. Both it and the editing choices do make these sequences quite hard to watch and quite hard to follow as well. There's a lot of times where it is quite difficult to make out what's actually happening. I do get the idea for it going more handheld than Steadicam, because it does add to the tension and chaotic nature and tone that this movie does have, especially since this is through Katniss's perspective. As I said, this movie does a really good job of putting you in her shoes. But as I said, there are a lot of sequences in this movie that are quite hard to make out. It's also a really cheap trick of being able to get around the age rating, because you're not really showing what happens on screen because it's just so shaky and chaotic that you can't quite see what's going on. So you're not actually seeing anything too graphic, but the idea is there. So I kind of understand why they decided to go in that direction to get a lower age rating to make this movie PG-13, 12A. But there were so much smarter and better ways to do it. And every single Hunger Games movie since then has found ways of doing it. But when it comes to the overall editing in this movie, it is pretty alright. The pacing is just right, it doesn't feel too long, and it focuses on what's most important. Plus, it does an excellent job of being able to tell its own story and set up what happens in part 2. And that's really impressive for a movie that clocks in at about 2 hours 20. I don't feel like the movie drags, and I do think that it is very watchable. I've also got to briefly say that some of the visual effects and CG effects that they do use throughout this movie, they don't look the best. Some of them do look a little bit dated, but I don't think they look that bad. I don't feel like any of the effects will take you out of the experience of this movie. I do think that everything does suit the tone, look and style quite well. But as I said, I do think there are a few things that do look a little bit dated and probably could have done with a little bit of an improvement. And lastly, when it comes to the soundtrack, James Newton Howard has created a fantastic score. The music of The Hunger Games is absolutely brilliant, and I honestly think it's some of James Newton Howard's best work. In my opinion, he is a very underrated film composer who has done so many different movies over the years. Just look at his line of work, you would be amazed at what he's worked on over the years. But when it comes to the music for this movie, for The Hunger Games, I do think that it does add an extra layer to the movie. It does add a lot more tension and atmosphere to the overall tone, and it does an excellent job of highlighting the characters' emotions. I also really like that the music changes depending on the location that the characters are in. Like in the districts, for instance, it's quite calm, almost acoustic at times. And then when they go into the capital, it's a lot more futuristic and sci-fi. Plus, I like how it's able to shift quite nicely between quite calm and mellow themes and much more frantic, more intense themes during the action sequences. There are some really nice themes that do appear throughout this movie, and I do think that they do stand out and they are memorable, especially during some of those sequences where the sound design actually gets kind of stripped back and the music is the only thing carrying those sequences. It makes those sequences a lot more powerful and effective, and I do think that the music itself is an integral part of the storytelling. Plus, I love all the little themes and jingles that they use throughout the Capitol and Caesar Flickerman show. They do sound like genuine anthems and theme songs that you would hear in a TV show, and it does help sell the believability. It is a genuinely great soundtrack, and I love just how many themes get to reappear in the sequels. Plus, like a lot of movies that were coming out in the 2010s that were based on these young adult novels, there was a tie-in album that does feature a load of songs from artists that were inspired by the movie. None of the songs actually play during the movie because it wouldn't make sense to do that, but you do hear them during the credits, but only some of them. I will admit they're not my favourite songs, and I don't think that it's my favourite album to come from a movie like this, but I do like the songs overall. I do think there are some good ones, and I do think that if you get the chance, it is worth listening to. Overall, I think this is an excellent movie and a brilliant start to the series. Yes, it does have a few issues, like a weak romantic subplot, a few moments that needed some explaining, and some really hard to watch shaky cam action sequences. But with that said, the character work and the performances are fantastic. The music is absolutely wonderful. The costumes, makeup, set and production designs are excellent. The use of practical effects and locations is great. And even though some of the CG effects look a tad dated, it doesn't take you out of the movie. Plus, the look and style, the sound design, the pacing and serious and gritty tone all add to make for a very tense and thrilling experience. It's dark, mature, complex, and it handles the story and themes in a very grounded and believable way. I would definitely say that this is worth checking out if you can. It is quite a violent movie, as I said, so if you do have kids that want to see this, don't forget this movie is rated a PG-13, 12A. It might be best to have a look at it first before deciding whether or not to let them see it or not. But as for me, I think this is a great movie and a brilliant start to the Katniss trilogy. So with all that being said, my rating for The Hunger Games is an 8 out of 10. Well, that is pretty much everything I want to say for this video, so if you have watched this video, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoy this content, please like, subscribe, and be sure to hit that notification button. If you have seen The Hunger Games, let me know down in the comments what you think about it. Plus, if you have any suggestions for any future rewind reviews you would like to see me do, let me know down below. Also, keep an eye on this channel later on in the year because I will be doing a rewind review for Catching Fire, and I'm really looking forward to doing that one. But until next time, thank you very much for watching, and may the odds be ever in your favour.